everyone for coming. I'm really, really happy to have Janeen Loehr here today. Janeen and I know each other since she was a postdoc and I was a PhD student, and since then we've been friends and colleagues working together and also keeping in touch. As you already heard, Janeen has a PhD from McGill University, where she worked with Caroline Palmer on action timing and prediction. And then she moved to the Netherlands, to Nijmegen University, to Radboud University and the Donders Institute there, where she worked with Nathalie Zeebans and Günther Knoblich, like Anna and me. And then shifted from studying action in individuals to studying action in joint settings, so with multiple persons. She then moved back to Canada and is now at the Department of Psychology in the University of Saskatchewan as an associate professor, where she studies action, interaction, but also very strongly the sense of joint agency, or the sense of agency in joint action, which is the topic for her talk. I also want to mention that Janeen was supposed to be here for a whole year visiting the IMC, and she kind of was, because she was a virtual visitor for a year, but it was not the same thing. So we're extremely happy to have you here for at least a week, which means if any one of you also wants to talk to her, she's here until Friday afternoon. Yes, glad to have you here.
Thanks, Cordula. It's really nice to be here. Also very weird to be traveling internationally, but it's basically the same as it always was, if anyone's wondering. Just as annoying, just as exciting. Okay, so yes, the title of my talk is The Sense of Agency in Joint Action. And let me start by explaining what I mean by the sense of agency in joint action. So, hold on. There. Okay, so I start with the term joint action, which probably I don't need to explain, but joint action is any time two or more people are coordinating their actions to achieve a common goal. I threw up a bunch of examples, so everything from carrying a heavy couch, which is our usual go-to example, through making music, dancing, pushing a car out of a snowbank. That's top of mind for me right now, because just before I left, we had our first major snowfall, and of course then the news coverage is all about people pushing their cars out of snowbanks, which is a very fun and intensive joint action. And a bunch of other things. And what these all have in common that I'm going to mention today is that they are what I'll call multi-level. So joint actions involve individual level contributions that are coordinated in some relation to achieve a collective level goal. So if we just take our usual example of two people moving a couch together, we can see that each person has their individual contribution. So the red person moves their end, the blue person moves their end, in some relation to each other, perhaps maybe complementary push-pull forces, something like that, and their collective goal is to move the couch. And I will argue here that this multi-level nature of joint action has really interesting consequences for the sense of agency, and that's what I will be focusing on today. So the sense of agency is your sense of generating and controlling actions and their consequences. It has been well studied in the context of solo action, so people doing actions on their own. And so I've just put a little illustration here. Your sense of agency, if you're this person moving the lamp, would be your feeling that I am moving the lamp, that I'm the one doing the action, so that I am the agent of the action that I'm doing. I put it as like a fully formed sentence in a thought bubble for illustrative purposes. Of course, we're not walking around thinking about how we're the agents of our actions, usually. Usually it's like a low-level, pre-reflective sense of being the agent of your actions, and only rarely, maybe if you're probed in an experiment or something really crazy happens, would you have this like high-level, explicit thought about it. But I will illustrate with thoughts. So in some sense, the sense of agency in solo action is in some sense straightforward, because it involves individual level agency over individual actions. Of course, crazy things can happen with the solo agency. You can have an illusory sense of agency over things you didn't do, or all kinds of stuff. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Instead, I'm going to focus on the contrast with joint action. So what happens to agency in the context of joint action? So let's just think about this from the perspective of one of the people in the joint action here. I won't make any claims that the two people share any of the same sense of agency or anything like that, but just thinking that about the perspective of the person in red. First of all, they can have a sense of individual level agency over their individual contribution to the joint action, right? So this will be the sense that I am moving my end of the couch. So just like you would see in solo action, so that's all fine. But of course there's other interesting things that can happen. So they might also have some sort of, some degree of a sense that their partner is the agent of their contribution. So a sense that you are moving your end of the couch. I'm not really going to talk much about that. It hasn't really been investigated by me or others. What is really interesting about joint action, though, is that there's also this collective level sense of agency over the joint action as a whole. So this would be your sense that we are moving the couch together. And that's something I'm going to talk more about in 2 slides from now. So that's what I think is really interesting about the sense of agency in joint action, is that we have these multiple things that could be going on at the same time. So I'm just going to summarize that in a slightly different visual format. This is just for the purposes of explaining, what I'm thinking about and where I'm going. So we can think about the sense of agency in joint action as a question of who is experiencing, which subject is experiencing agency over which part of a joint action. And so I've said already that you can have a sense that I am moving my end of the couch, so I am the agent of my part of the joint action. And when I is the subject, I will call that self-agency. And then I also said that we can have a sense that my partner is the agent of their contribution, so you're moving your end of the couch. If I was going to talk about that, I would call it partner agency. And then there is the collective level agency, the sense that we are moving the couch together. And that is referred to as joint agency. And then, as I said, I'm not really going to talk about this part, but I just want to mention there's other possibilities that can also happen. So you can also have a sense that you have some agency over your partner's contribution. So you're a sense that I'm moving your end of the couch. So like if a really strong person was moving a couch with a really weak person, the strong person may have the experience that they're in control to a certain degree over the other person's end of the couch as well. And it can crisscross in the other direction as well, but I won't get into that for now. Okay. So this is just to lay out sort of the terminology and how we're going to talk about these things. And then I want to say a bit more about joint agencies. There's a literature on joint agency, both some early writings about what the sense of joint agency is, and then some empirical work on how it goes in joint action tasks. And there's sort of 3 forms that the sense of joint agency can take, so I'm going to talk about them here. So this is based on sort of foundational work by Pashery in 2012, writing by Tollefson in 2014, and then we've done some lab studies of this as well, and other people have as well. So one common thing is for the sense of joint agency to be a sense of shared agency. So this is the sense that control is distributed between the agents in a joint action. And you would probably see this when you're moving a couch with someone. So you would have a sense that I'm moving my end and you're moving your end, and together we're controlling the direction and the movement of the couch. So a sense of shared control. And then there is also the possibility that people might have a sense of relatively independent agency. So you have 2 agents acting together, but they have a sense that they're working towards the same shared goal, but somewhat independently of each other. I just like to illustrate this with a puzzle example. So if you had 2 people who are, one person's in charge of the blue pieces and one person's in charge of the red pieces, but together they're making a picture of like a barn against a blue sky, they may have a sense they're acting relatively independently, but nevertheless coordinating towards their shared goal. And then on the other end, there is a sense of united agency, where this is the sense that people in a joint action are acting as a single unit. So this is thought to involve a blurring between self and other. It's thought to happen in large-scale joint actions, like this beautiful dance that we see here. Thanks to Marianne for this illustration. Yes, okay, so those are the 3 sort of forms that joint agency takes, and I'll be talking about each of them in different projects today. Okay, so just to go back to my little visual representation, we just add these 3 options for joint agency here. And then my research that I'll be talking about today is looking both at the sort of like why people experience these different types of agency in joint action. So, what are the cues that push people to have a strong sense of self-agency or a weak sense of self-agency, or different forms of joint agency? I'm also interested in the brain mechanisms that underlie this as well, but I won't be talking about that in this talk. I will talk about that a little bit tomorrow at the EEG hyperscanning workshop. And then also I'm interested in sort of the so what. So, what are the consequences of having experienced, in particular, joint agency with other people? Does this sense play into our ability to perform well as a group? So like action monitoring and correction and that sort of thing. What role does this play in social bonding, and can we take advantage of these experiences of joint agency to benefit mental health in some way? And if time permits, I will talk about our first foray into that area at the end of the talk. Then I also just want to mention that I have, especially in recent years, started down a path towards more of a multi-method approach to understanding the sense of agency and joint action. So you will see in this talk a variety of different methods. So we got some experimental designs in lab-based settings, and then more recently we've taken towards using qualitative methods, trying to investigate things in real-world contexts as well. Okay, so that's kind of the introduction, and then here's what I'm planning to tell you about today, just a set of research projects from the lab. The first few are really focused on cues to agency and joint action. So the first couple studies I'll tell you about are lab-based studies where we looked at the cues that push people towards a strong or weak sense of self-agency and joint agency, and in particular how the relations between the parts of a joint action, the relations between individual contributions, might influence joint agency. And then I'll shift gears a bit towards a study looking at starting to understand the contexts that might evoke a sense of united agency, and then the sensations and emotions that are involved in that. And then I will just end with a study that we've just done looking at whether we can use joint agency evoking task to benefit people's quality of life. Okay, so starting with a couple of studies looking at the cues to agency and joint action. So these studies were inspired by three things kind of coming together at the same time. So there's sort of a recent evidence growing that our mental representations of joint action include not only each person's individual goals and the shared goal, but also relations between parts of a joint action. So these could be spatial relations, so like, are we moving in the same direction or opposite directions? Temporal relations, like are we moving in synchrony or taking turns? And if you're doing musical joint actions, harmonic relations between what harmonic relations are we creating together? Second, some early emerging evidence that self-agency and joint agency might be more strongly influenced by individual level cues for self-agency versus relational cues for joint agency. So there's a couple studies out by Labars and colleagues showing that, for example, sensory motor cues really have a strong impact on the sense of self-agency, whereas the relation between parts, so like whether people are making equal contributions or like high and low contributions to the joint action, or whether people receive equal rewards after the fact or unequal rewards, have a stronger impact on joint agency. And then my interest is in understanding cues to agency in musical joint action for a variety of reasons. One is that musical joint actions are nice in that each person's individual contribution elicits a separate action effect, and those have to be precisely coordinated in time to make the musical output. Right, so each person's playing their instrument and making their own sounds, and the sounds have to be coordinated in time. And that's a little bit different than other tasks that are used to study agency and joint action. Often it's two people working to move a dot on a screen towards a target, which involves each person's actions coordinating into the movement of the dot. So each person doesn't have their own separate effect, but rather it's a single shared outcome. So here, I just find it interesting that each person has their own separate outcome and they have to be coordinated. And then of course, musical joint action offers a rich context for examining questions about agency and joint action. It features heavily in Pachauri's foundational writings about joint agency, for example, in part because musical joint action can elicit powerful experiences of united agency. That reminds me, I meant to say that united agency is often referred to as we agency in the literature, and I just use the term united to avoid confusion about the subject we and the type of joint agency. but really those are kind of meaning the same thing. Anyways, this book by Gabrielson, which is called Strong Experiences with Music, is about strong experiences with music across the board, but has really lovely examples of people talking about their experiences of United Agency, which I will actually show a couple of those later. And then, of course, musical paradigms are also a really lovely way to test joint action questions because they allow for a nice balance of experimental control and ecological validity, and then we can have a large variety of rich manipulations of different cues to agency in this case. Okay, so those are all coming together into driving the questions behind these two studies. And so here we're going to try to examine the effects of different relations between parts on self-agency and joint agency in joint music performance. And we start with perceptual relations between parts. So I had mentioned the studies earlier that showed that, sort of like high level relations such as like equality of contributions or the rewards you receive have an impact on joint agency. Here we wanted to study lower level relations in terms of the perceptual outcome of the joint action. And so we had pairs of participants come in and play short simple duets for us of familiar children's songs. If you don't read music, that's the beginning of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. I'll also play a little video of this performance. We manipulated two things: which part the person performs. So on half the trials, the person performed the melody, and on the other half, they performed the accompaniment. And then we manipulated how far away the accompaniment was from the melody. So these are the same accompaniments, just one is shifted down an octave to be further away from the melody. And we had people play these duets together, and then after each trial we had them rate their sense of self-agency, so their sense of control over the melody or the accompaniment, depending on which part they were playing, and their sense of joint agency, so their sense of control over the music as a whole. And we did this on a rating scale ranging from independent to shared. We didn't include United Agency because, I don't know, we just at the time we didn't think that people would really experience a sense of United Agency in this very simple task. And I think that ends up being true. So here's our hypotheses. So for the sense of self-agency, we thought that this would be influenced by the perceptual salience of people's individual contributions. So basically, like to the degree to which you can pick out your own part, you would have a stronger sense of agency for your part. So we should see a stronger sense of agency for the melody, for people playing the melody compared to the accompaniment. The melody is in a higher pitch range, which is more salient, plus the melody is familiar to people as well. And then we were quite interested in what would happen to joint agency, and so here we thought that the perceptual relations between the parts would have an impact, that we would see stronger joint agency for the near accompaniment condition than the far accompaniment condition. And this was based on auditory stream segregation effects in the literature, where if you have two sequences of pitches, if they're at a relatively large distance apart, they tend to split into separate perceptual streams, whereas if they're at close distances, they tend to fuse together into a single stream. And we thought that would probably impact people's sense of joint agency as well. Okay, and then we had people play these duets. We actually wanted to test not just expert musicians, but also novices to get partly because expert musicians probably have different agency experiences given their, performance requirements and these sorts of things. And so we had we had novices and musicians come in and play these duets using these electronic music boxes pioneered by Peter Keller, Giacomo Novembre, really fun to use. And so basically what these do is they just translate rotation movements into auditory output. And you can have pairs of people come in and play them together, and you don't really need previous musical experience in order to make these movements and play songs together. So I have a little video of what this looks like. And these are the people who actually ran these experiments. So this is my former postdoc, Justin Christensen, who is in charge of the first study, and graduate student Zijun Zhao, who is in charge of the second study that you'll see. And here they are playing a little duet together. that simple. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so we have people come in, play duets together, rate their sense of self-agency and joint agency. Oops, sorry. Okay. Here's what we see for self-agency. Okay, so here I'm plotting self-agency on the y-axis, so from no control over the melody or accompaniment to full control. In the white bars, you see the ratings when people are playing the melody, and in the gray bars when they're playing the accompaniment. And then on the left, when the accompaniment is far from the melody, and on the right, when it's near to the melody. And what you can see is that people have a stronger sense of self-agency over their own part when they're playing the melody compared to when they're playing the accompaniment. And also when the two parts are further apart compared to closer together. So that's good. That's in line with what we expected. But what we didn't expect was that there was no impact of these different conditions on people's sense of joint agency over the music as a whole. So you can see the joint agency scale ranging from relatively independent to relatively shared, and really no difference between the conditions. That was a bit surprising to us, and so we did some exploratory analyses, and what was really driving people's sense of joint agency in this task was how well coordinated they were. So this is still joint agency on the y-axis, but now coordination performance essentially on the x-axis, where 0 asynchrony is unachievably good performance, and then it gets worse as you go off to the right. And what you can see is that people have a strong sense of joint agency when they're performing well together, and it really drops off as they perform less and less well. So there's a strong impact of coordination performance in this task. So just as a summary, as we expected, individual level perceptual information did strongly influence joint agency, but unexpectedly, did I say joint? Self-agency. Unexpectedly, joint agency was not influenced by perceptual relations between parts, and instead coordination performance was the main driver in this study. And although that surprised us, it also does align with other work. So for example, there's a study by Reddish that came out around the same time as we were running the study or analyzing the data, and they had people synchronize this kind of movement with each other, and they showed that perceived coordination performance had a strong impact on joint agency, but neither the instructions that people received, like explicitly required to coordinate versus incidentally coordinating, or the role people took on, leader and follower, had any impact on joint agency. And in our own work, not using sort of musical joint action where you have to synchronize, but a different sort of alternating tapping task, we had also shown that coordination performance has a strong mediating effect, is a mediator of task effects on joint agency. So that led us to wonder whether coordination is the primary cue to joint agency in tasks whose primary goal is to precisely coordinate with each other. And so that led us to our second study, where we now attempt to investigate temporal and harmonic relations between parts and how they impact the sense of joint agency. So again, we had pairs come in and create these auditory sequences, synchronized auditory sequences with each other. On half the trials, we still have been doing duets. Still familiar children's songs, and because they're duets, of course, they're very simple. You have to synchronize the note onsets, each pair of note onsets with each other, but you also have to align the melody with the accompaniment, and in doing so, you're creating a sense of harmony that is dynamic over the course of the sequence, and you're also creating these sort of complex temporal relations in the form of meter, so you're perceiving strong and weak beats in the music. So you have complex temporal and harmonic relations when you're playing duets together. And then we contrast that with a task that also requires precisely synchronized note onsets, but doesn't have the overlying harmony or meter, strongly anyway, where they're just playing a sequence of constant pitches, and they just have to synchronize the note onsets together. This time, we had people rate their sense of agency on a visual analog scale, which hopefully you can see, ranging from almost perfectly overlapping self and partner at the bottom to sort of very separate at the top. We had people rate how integrated they felt with their partner during the task. And then we also had the participants do separate post-experiment interviews about why they made the ratings they did in each condition. We wanted to get a feel for people's sense of the cues that were driving their ratings in this study, partly because our own experiences during these duets were quite interesting. So we did that at the end of the experiment. And our hypotheses were fairly simple. So if joint agency does indeed go beyond coordination, simple coordination, then we should see stronger joint agency for duets that have these complex temporal and harmonic relations, even if we see, or despite equivalent coordination in the two conditions. And then we thought people's interview responses might suggest cues other than coordination, not exclusively other than coordination, but just in general. Okay, so here's what we find. So now we have joint agency here, weaker joint agency and stronger, so this would be the two overlapping circles at the top. And you can see they have a stronger joint agency experience for the duets compared to the constant pitches. And of course we checked that their coordination performance is relatively equal between the two conditions, so there's no difference there. We also checked this in a different way. So we also checked for an effect of coordination on joint agency. So this is this kind of similar plot as I showed you before, where we have joint agency here and good coordination on this end of the x-axis and bad coordination over there. And what you can see is that people's ratings are higher for the duets compared to the pitches at each of these asynchronies that are starred here, so up to a certain point. Once they start to get really kind of bad coordination, then there's really no difference between conditions, but at least we know that with relatively good coordination, at equivalent levels of coordination, they have stronger joint agency for the duets than the constant pitches. And then here is a summary of what they said in their post-experiment interviews. This is basically an overall thematic map of the themes that we found when we analyzed their interview responses. There's a lot going on here, and I will get into these on some future slides, but mainly what you need to see is that people did mention their perception of performance, for sure, but they also talked a lot about their knowledge of the music, as well as task difficulty and task enjoyability. So I will unpack the themes and the sub-themes that came out of their responses. I would say these are interesting not just for understanding agency in joint action, but also just understanding people's experiences of joint action in general, musical joint action. So the first theme that came out was perception of performance. So people did mention that they thought they had higher ratings in the musical duets than the constant pitches because they were just generally doing better in that condition. And a few people did specifically mention synchronization, where they say things like, for the constant pitches, I didn't feel as in sync as with the musical duets. People also mentioned a sense of mutual adaptation in the musical duets compared to kind of independent action in the constant pitches. So for example, when playing the duets, I know that she was trying to match my beat and I was trying to match hers, so there was some sort of connection going on. Whereas the constant pitches, it just felt more like a computer than I was doing a duet with her. This was nice for me because there's a couple more quotes like this that really reinforce the idea that people can have that independent sense of agency when they're doing these kinds of tasks together. And then the other major theme that came out was people talking about their knowledge of the music and how that impacted their sense of agency. So they talked about the general musical structure, so saying things like there's a template to go off of, it's built in, music has a melody or more rhythm to it, whereas the constant pitches are just ticking noises. Note that also these people are, for the most part, non-musicians, so they don't have like a sophisticated language for articulating these things, but still articulating the general musical structure there. And they also talk about their specific song knowledge, so like I knew the songs already. And within that sub-theme, many people mentioned using auditory imagery as a way to help them coordinate. So with the musical duets, I felt like we knew the music from before, so I could try to hear that in my mind. And then people also mentioned having expectations about what the pace should be based on their previous experience with the song. So you already know the duets, you know the song already, you have a pace you're used to listening to it to. That's general for everybody that you learn from being a child. And when you spin it, you know what's to come. And then people also made assumptions about what other people would know. So, you know, everybody learns that from when they're a child. People would say things, I was trying to go my speed that I thought the song was supposed to be like, and she was going her speed. People would mention also like, well, I knew the songs, but I think maybe my partner didn't because they were from a different cultural background and stuff like that. So people would make assumptions about what their partner knows or doesn't know. And people did mention that they use this knowledge to make predictions about what's supposed to come next. So you can follow along, there's a rhythm to it, you can go, oh, that's what's supposed to happen next. And that's nice because one of the main things that's thought to drive a sense of joint agency is your ability to make predictions about what your partner is going to do or when they're going to do it. And so that comes out in their interview responses as well. They also mentioned task difficulty. For the people who do talk about task difficulty, most of them say they find the musical duets easier because they already knew the music. They mention either the general musical structure or their knowledge of the songs, saying that it's easier to sync up or to match up the melody with the accompaniment. A small number of people found the constant pitches easier because they only required synchronized onsets. So I found it easier when we were just trying to line up the constant pitches than to try to complement the melody and the harmony. And this I find nice because it really reconstructs the manipulation that we did, where we were trying to manipulate this sort of simple synchronized onsets versus more complex alignment of melody and accompaniment. So thanks to my participants for that. And then people also mentioned part performed, which gets at their sense of self-agency. So the melody is what everyone knows, so the accompaniment was a bit more difficult because I kept getting lost in the melody. Or with the constant pitches, I forgot which one was mine, whether it was the high pitch or the low pitch. So this is suggesting that that sense of self-agency is coming into play in their ratings of joint agency. And this is something that needs more investigation because we don't really have a strong handle on how the things relate. They're correlated to a certain degree, but under what conditions and to what extent we don't really know yet. And then the last theme that that was evident in their responses was task enjoyability. So people generally had, they felt that the musical duets created more pleasant sounds and more pleasant feelings, which are illustrated in this quote. So I felt more comfortably connected with my partner on the duets, like we were making something more beautiful than the constant pitches, where it was just nothing. We did ask them in the post-experiment interviews to rate how good they felt when they were doing the two conditions, and you can see, yes, higher for the musical duets than the constant pitches. So in this study, we show that joint agency is strengthened by these more complex temporal and harmonic relations between the parts of the joint action. We see that both in the ratings after each trial and in the post-experiment interviews, where people certainly do mention coordination as a driving force, but also they talk about the structure of the music and the familiarity of the song being performed. This study does reinforce the point that coordination is an important cue to joint agency. People do talk about how their higher level knowledge of the music might impact their joint agency ratings via its effect on coordination or task difficulty. A few participants did mention that. Also reinforces something we already know too from previous work, that metacognition about agency and metacognition about performance are closely related, although they're not perfectly overlapping. And then I just think that this the causal relationship between joint agency and task enjoyment needs further investigation, because I think it's not clear at this point whether experiencing a strong sense of joint agency causes the task to be more enjoyable or whether the opposite relation holds. So that will require future work. Okay, so that is my walk through these two studies, looking at self-agency and joint agency in this lab type setting. Now I will shift gears a little bit. So the lab type setting does not lend itself very well to studying united agency, at least not so far, because it's usually experienced in different contexts than coming into a lab with one other person who maybe you don't know. I guess I would say we don't know enough about it to create lab-based experiments that would reliably elicit a strong sense of united agency. So to get a better handle on that, we are currently running a study trying to get a handle on the different contexts that elicit a strong sense of united agency, as well as the sensations and emotions that accompany it. So I'll get into that one next. So this table represents the sort of, so what we know about united agencies so far is largely coming from first-hand reports of united agency that are evident in research that's been done for other reasons. Basically, there's sort of not a like a large empirical database about the sense of united agency specifically, but you can find references to it in a variety of writings about different contexts. Many of the time it's in music-related writings. And so these quotes here are all quotes that describe experiencing a sense of united agency. And they're pulled from different things. So this is Gabrielson's book, Strong Experiences of Music. And in there are many references to this sense, sometimes in large group music making, sometimes in small group music making, sometimes as an audience member moving with the music. And then again in a large community choir. And then there's references in other contexts as well. So sometimes you see this when writing about dancing at a rave. This is a paper about Japanese motorcycle groups. These are groups that do sort of like coordinated driving, and they talk about, at least one person in those groups has talked about their sense of united agency in that task. There's little hints in sports as well. This quote comes from like elite pair figure skating duo. And there's hints in other sports, although it hasn't been systematically investigated that I know of. So these are all great, and they're wonderful quotes. And what we set out to do was to try to survey people's experiences of united agency in group music making to see if we could get a handle on what contexts make this happen, and so on. And so we're currently running a qualitative study using the critical incident technique. This is where you ask people to write in detail about an experience or one or two experiences that they remember very vividly. And so we're running an anonymous survey, asking people to describe one or two incidents of powerful experiences of acting as one, trying to capture a breadth of experiences. And so far we've collected 22 stories from 19 participants. I will have a link if anyone has a story they want to add. I will have a link in a couple slides. And so what I'll show you today is just a very preliminary analysis of our preliminary data set, so you can see what we've got so far. And I just want to start by going through parts of one story. They're really lovely stories to read. So I'll just read a little bit of this. So this person says, the most powerful experience I can remember is the first orchestra rehearsal I took part in at the beginning of 5th grade. This person, by the way, is age 66, writing about a long ago experience, obviously very memorable. She says, we were shown the conducting gestures for picking up our instruments together, how to wait for the downbeat. We were instructed what note to play. Then there was silence. Instruments returned to laps. The upbeat, instruments up and ready, then the downbeat, and a tsunami of sound that surrounded me as we all played together. It was absolutely the most powerful experience that I've ever had of being part of a group, but also my part in contributing to the group. And then she goes on to say, how long did the experience last? A few seconds, and my whole life. It's a sensation I've drawn on and continue to draw on throughout my life. When I teach, I purposely attempt to recall the sensation of that first rehearsal because for me, it was like being initiated into the harmony of the spheres, the harmony of the universe. So obviously a very powerful, meaningful, memorable experience. They're not all this intense, but they are all really nice to read as a group. Sometimes if I'm feeling down about the news, I just pull out my Excel spreadsheet and just read these stories. Okay, so what can we tell from the stories we have so far? What I can tell you is that United Agency seems to happen in a sort of wide variety of contexts within group music making. So people sometimes mention that it was in a rehearsal or in a public performance. When they mention it, it's about like half and half between the two, so it's not always in public. Sometimes it's at the first rehearsal. People talk about it happening for a single note or a single chord, and then all the way through to the entire movement of a piece or all 33 minutes of a piece. It's happening in all group sizes. So people mentioned duets, quartets, medium-sized group, large group. That's interesting because, again, as I think I mentioned, it's thought that this sense of united agency should happen mostly in large group contexts, but we certainly do see duets represented here as well. People talk about being, performing as an amateur versus a professional. It sort of leans more heavily towards amateur than professional. And then represented both in terms of singing in a choir or playing an instrument in a group. And then a couple of just really interesting things in this first set of stories is that a few people actually mentioned that it was that they sense that the time they're recalling is the first activity of the first rehearsal of the first large group music making they ever did, which is really interesting. And it's not always the first performance of a piece or something like that. Like one person mentioned it was just performing scales as a group. And then many people are also telling stories from their youth even many years later. So these are obviously memorable experiences. And then I also did a quick a preliminary analysis of some of the themes that come out in people's descriptions about the sensations of united agency. So people mentioned sort of auditory and bodily sensations, so being washed in a bath of sound or feeling tingles or feeling warm. A couple people mentioned a sense of being lifted up, so as if we were running and then suddenly our feet left the ground and we were airborne. There is descriptions of loss of self-agency and blurring of self and other. So you see things like it's a feeling that the music has a life of its own and you're just witnessing it. And people describe feeling that they're in a mind meld or as if our minds were in sync. And one person explicitly describing their thoughts, where they normally have their thoughts shifting back and forth from themselves to the group, but experiencing that as blurred. And then there's sort of higher level, bigger picture things. So being part of something bigger than oneself. So one person described it as feeling like an organ in a living creature. Of course, there's a powerful sense of togetherness. And then, as I said, some people really mentioned it being profoundly meaningful. So I already read you that first quote there. And having a long-lasting impact. So it changed the way I look at all performances I play today. And then the last thing I did is I picked out all the emotion words and I made a word cloud of them. So these are all the emotions that people describe as part of their experience of united agency. All kinds of nice things. Chills, powerful, emotional, transcendence, goosebumps, all these things. So if you have a story that you would like to add, this is the link to the survey. It's anonymous. Hopefully the QR code works. So what we can conclude so far is that a united agency does occur in a variety of different contexts, as I said, like small and large groups, rehearsals and performances, single notes, whole movements. Involves bodily sensations and has effects on self-agency. It's meaningful and it elicits very positive emotions. Okay, so that's my foray into the sense of united agency. And then the last thing I want to talk about is attempting to see if we can sort of use joint agency related tasks to benefit people's quality of life. And so the last project I'll talk about is the Music Memory Makers project, which is a wellness intervention for dementia care. And I should say that the main focus of this project is not joint agency. That's sort of just my interest in this project. This project came together from a collaboration with sort of a multidisciplinary group of people. As you can see from the things that sort of drew the project together. And so basically what we're trying to do is use this sort of like music box duet making task to see if spousal couples living with dementia can use these to make music together and feel more connected to each other. And so part of the inspiration comes from the dementia literature, where we know that spouses of people living with dementia spend the most time providing care, and they report relationship strain and depression and a lower sense of well-being as a result. But on the positive side, a sense of couplehood can relieve those demands of spousal care, and shared activities are recommended to support relationship continuity. Then we also know that music provides a safe and rich environment to interact with others. So group music making, affects social bonding and mental health benefits, and musical behaviors can continue even in severe dementia. And so what we wanted to do was to make some developments on the eMusic boxes to, I put this in parentheses because this was just me thinking like, oh, we could elicit stronger joint agency experiences if we do this, but mainly to examine their feasibility as a tool for meaningful interaction between couples over the disease course. And so here's what we did. We just made a few modifications. So first we sorted out a way to arrange commercial songs as duets. We wanted to be able to ask participants to like suggest the music they want to play together so that they could suggest, music that's meaningful for them as a couple that would elicit, strong autobiographical memories and this sort of thing. So we asked them for their recommendations, and then we used Open Unmix to separate the songs into different sources. And so we separated the vocals, the drums, the bass, guitars, and the keys into individual parts, and then we split them up so that one person would get the main voice and one or two other instruments, and the other person would be given the other vocal part and remaining instruments. I can play that, what it sounds like. So this would be the main voice. Sorry, that was very loud, unexpectedly. And here's the other part. Okay, I'll play what that sounds like as a duet in a minute. Okay, then we added also some coordination smoothing. So people with dementia can have, movement-related issues can make coordinating more difficult. And so we added some online coordination smoothing. Basically 7 different levels for the possibility of making it easier to coordinate. I can get into the details of that later if anyone's interested. We also had to add a little bit of volume accents in response to slow click motions to restore. Like if you smooth the coordination, then you can lose the sense of agency because the way you're moving doesn't translate directly into the sounds that are being produced. And so we just added little volume accents to sort of offset that. And then we added this sort of nuclear option, the resync option, so that you could actually push, in this experiment, the experimenter could push a button to get people back together immediately if they got too far off track. We instructed our research assistant not to use it too often, and so she really didn't use it very often at all. And since then we've automated it so that you can actually, the program can bring you back together if you get too far off. And then the last thing we did is we just tried to make the interface a little bit more adaptable for people, so we just had different size handles and different sleeves and stuff. And this we're still working on, so we've now 3D printed a different shape of box to try to, partly because those are based on DJ Heroes, which are not as easily available as they once were, so we have a 3D print to convince you that all of this is interesting and worth investigating. And then just end by acknowledging all the trainees and researchers on the project and my collaborators. And funding sources, and then there's that link again if anyone wants to. I gotta plug my survey. Yeah, that's it.